The story of the ancient Israelites is one of the most fascinating and debated narratives in human history. For centuries, they have been known as the people of the one true God, a nation whose faith laid the foundation for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But what if the story was more complicated? What if, hidden beneath the pages of the Bible, behind the ruins of temples, and buried in ancient inscriptions, there lies evidence that the earliest Israelites may have acknowledged and perhaps even worshipped multiple gods? It's a question that shakes the pillars of tradition and challenges the core of monotheism itself. And yet the clues have been there all along, in verses that seem strangely out of place, in artifacts pulled from the sands of the Levant, and in the echoes of a world where the line between the God of Israel and the gods of the nations was not always as clear as we imagine. To understand this, we must go back, far back, to a time before the great kings of Israel, before the temple in Jerusalem, even before the conquest of Canaan. We begin in a world where gods were everywhere, in the sky, in the rivers, in the mountains, and in the carved idols that stood in every village square. The people who would one day become the Israelites emerged in the midst of this polytheistic tapestry. Their neighbors, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, all had their own divine pantheons. Baal, the storm god, who brought the rains. Asherah, the mother goddess, source of fertility. Chemosh, the god of Moab. Molech, to whom children were sacrificed in the flames. The earliest Israelites did not live in a vacuum. They traded with these nations, intermarried with them, and sometimes went to war with them. And in times of peace, in times of drought, or in times of fear, they may have looked to their neighbors' gods for help. The Bible itself does not shy away from this. Again and again, it tells the story of Israel turning to other gods. In the book of Judges, we read of cycles where the people worship Yahweh, then abandon him for Baal and Asherah,
we read of cycles
only to
where
cry
the
out
people worship
and return
Yahweh,
when calamity
then
strikes.
abandon him for Baal
The
and
prophets,
Asherah.
Elijah, Hosea, Jeremiah, thundered against this unfaithfulness, condemning the worship of the hosts of heaven and the building of altars on every high hill and under every green tree. But here is the uncomfortable truth. These warnings were not given in a vacuum. They were given because the people were actually doing it. They were not theoretical admonitions. They were calls to stop what was already happening. Archaeology supports this uncomfortable reality. In the ancient site of Kuntillet Ajrud in the Sinai, inscriptions have been found dating to the 8th century BCE that refer to Yahweh and His Asherah. This startling phrase suggests that some Israelites may have believed Yahweh had a divine consort, much like El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, who was paired with Asherah. In these inscriptions, Yahweh is depicted not as the sole divine being in existence, but as part of a divine pair, a king and queen of heaven. For some scholars, this is evidence that early Israelite religion began as a form of henotheism, the worship of one god above others, without denying the existence of those others. In other words, the earliest Israelites may have believed that other gods were real. They simply considered Yahweh to be their God, the most powerful, the most worthy of worship. Even the 10 Commandments seem to hint at this early stage of belief. The very first commandment in Exodus says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, "There are no other gods." Instead, it assumes their existence but forbids their worship. It is the language of loyalty, not of metaphysical exclusivity. And then there is Psalm 8:2, one of the most enigmatic passages in the Hebrew Bible. It opens with the words, "God stands in the divine council. Among the gods he renders judgment." The scene is one where Yahweh presides over a heavenly assembly of other divine beings, chastising them for ruling unjustly. Who are these gods in his council? Angels? Spirits? Or remnants of an older polytheistic worldview, preserved in poetic form? The more we look, the more we see these hints scattered verses that speak of the sons of God in Genesis, of "Let us make man in our image," in the creation account of Michael and Gabriel, and other named beings who serve in a celestial hierarchy, a divine court, a council of the holy ones, a pantheon under one supreme ruler. Yet as the centuries passed, the prophets and reforming kings pushed Israel toward a stricter monotheism. Hezekiah removed the high places. Josiah destroyed the altars to Baal and the Asherah poles. The exile in Babylon further solidified a theology in which Yahweh was not just Israel's God, he was the only God in existence. The older language of divine councils and rival gods was reinterpreted to fit this sharper, exclusive vision. But the traces remain, in stone, in scripture, and in the collective memory of a people who once lived in a world filled with many gods, but who were called to follow one above them all. To trace the evolution of Israel's beliefs, we must step beyond the pages of the Bible and into the dust of the ancient Near East, into the shards of pottery, the weathered inscriptions, and the forgotten temples that tell a parallel story. In the ruins of ancient Samaria, archaeologists have uncovered household idols, small figurines of goddesses with exaggerated features, believed to represent Asherah or other fertility deities. These were not hidden in royal treasuries or secret vaults. They were found in everyday homes, suggesting that ordinary Israelites kept them close, perhaps alongside symbols of Yahweh. These artifacts whisper of a faith that was far more blended than our modern image of pure, unbroken monotheism. In the desert fortress of Arad, a temple was unearthed, complete with a holy place, incense altars, and standing stones. Yet one detail stood out. There were 2 stone pillars in the most sacred space, where later Israelite religion would place only the Ark of the Covenant or a single representation of Yahweh's presence. Were these stones meant to symbolize Yahweh and a consort? Or Yahweh and another divine figure entirely? The temple's destruction is believed to have occurred during the religious reforms of King Josiah, when local shrines were torn down in favor of centralized worship in Jerusalem. Even more provocative is the linguistic evidence. In early inscriptions, Yahweh's name appears alongside that of El, the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon, as though they were separate beings. Over time, their identities seem to merge, with Yahweh taking on El's titles, such as Creator of Heaven and Earth, and God Most High. It is as if the God of a particular people gradually absorbed the attributes of the high God of the region, becoming supreme not just in Israel, but in the cosmic order. This blending wasn't unique to Israel. In the ancient world, conquering nations often adopted the gods of the lands they ruled, folding them into their own pantheons or equating them with their own deities. The Israelites, surrounded by powerful empires, may have adapted similar strategies, except that instead of adding Yahweh to a larger pantheon, they elevated him until all others faded into shadows. But before those others disappeared, they left their mark. The god Baal, for instance, was not always depicted as a rival to Yahweh. In some early texts, he is simply one of the sons of God who served under the high god's authority. Only later does he become the adversary, the false god whose prophets Elijah famously confronted on Mount Carmel. This transformation from divine subordinate to pagan enemy mirrors the theological shift toward exclusivity. Then there is the question of the host of heaven, a phrase the Bible uses to describe the sun, moon, stars, and perhaps other celestial beings. Kings like Manasseh of Judah openly promoted their worship, building altars to them within the very courts of the Jerusalem temple. To modern ears, this sounds like idolatry, but in the ancient mindset, these celestial bodies may have been seen as divine agents or members of Yahweh's court until reformers reclassified them as false gods. One of the most striking archaeological finds comes from a small village site where a storage jar was found with an inscription reading, "Blessed be Uriahu by Yahweh, and by his Asherah." The phrase is simple, casual even, but it reveals that for at least some Israelites, invoking Yahweh and Asherah together was not heresy. It was tradition. In many ways, these discoveries point toward a belief system in transition. Israel's faith did not begin as the stark philosophical monotheism we know today. It began in a land of many gods, where loyalty to one did not necessarily require denying the existence of others. Over centuries, through war, exile, and reform, that loyalty hardened into exclusivity, and exclusivity became doctrine. Yet there are passages in the Hebrew Scriptures that still preserve the older worldview, even if unintentionally. The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy speaks of the Most High giving nations their inheritance, according to the number of the sons of God, as though different gods were assigned to different peoples, with Yahweh taking Israel as his portion. In Job, the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh, suggesting a heavenly court of multiple divine beings. These glimpses are not the fabrications of modern skeptics. They are relics embedded in the very texts that define Israel's faith. And perhaps the most telling sign of this transition is how fiercely later writers and prophets sought to erase or reinterpret these traces. Idols were smashed, altars destroyed, alternative narratives recast as the work of false prophets. But archaeology has a way of preserving what theology tries to forget. In the shattered remains of high place altars in inscriptions etched by ordinary hands, in the goddess figurines buried in the corners of ancient homes, we see a portrait of a people whose journey to monotheism was not instantaneous, but gradual. A path walked over centuries, shaped by politics, culture, and the very human tendency to blend old beliefs with new revelations. If the archaeology offers one path into this mystery, the ancient poetry and prophetic writings offer another, one that leads us straight into the heavens. Psalm 82 is one of the most haunting glimpses into the spiritual imagination of ancient Israel. It begins with a scene almost alien to later monotheism. God stands in the divine council. Among the gods, he renders judgment. The image is not of a solitary deity ruling in isolation, but of Yahweh presiding over an assembly of other divine beings. In this celestial courtroom, he accuses them of injustice, declaring that they will die like mortals. The psalm ends with a plea, "Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance." Who are these gods that Yahweh addresses? The Hebrew word used here, Elohim, can refer to God himself. But in this context, it appears to denote a group of spiritual entities. Later tradition reinterprets them as angels, but the language is older, heavier, more in line with the pantheons of Israel's neighbors. It suggests that Israel's earliest conception of the spiritual realm was not an empty throne room, but a court filled with subordinate deities or powerful cosmic beings. This idea of a divine council surfaces in other passages as well. In 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah describes a vision where Yahweh is seated on his throne, surrounded by the host of heaven, and they discuss how to entice King Ahab into a fatal battle. In Job 1, the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh, and among them walks the accuser, the Satan. In Genesis 6, the sons of God descend to earth, take human wives, and give rise to the Nephilim, mighty men of renown. For a people surrounded by polytheistic cultures, the notion of a heavenly court would have been entirely natural. It was the divine equivalent of a royal court on earth. The difference in Israel's telling was that Yahweh was supreme, not one God among equals, but the ruler of all. Still, the echoes of a time when divine beings held power beneath him persisted, preserved in poetic fragments and prophetic visions. The prophets, however, were relentless in their campaign to sever Israel from the allure of other gods. Elijah stood on Mount Carmel and called down fire to prove that Baal was powerless. Hosea portrayed Israel's idolatry as the betrayal of a faithless spouse, warning that their flirtation with other gods would lead to ruin. Jeremiah thundered against those who burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, calling it a provocation against the Lord. These weren't abstract sermons. They were declarations of war, spiritual, cultural, and political. The worship of other gods wasn't just a theological problem. It was a threat to Israel's national identity. In a region where political alliances were often sealed through shared worship, turning to a neighbor's god could mean turning loyalty away from Israel itself. The final blow to Israel's flirtation with polytheism came not from a prophet's words, but from catastrophe. In 586 BCE, Babylon's armies breached Jerusalem's walls, burned the temple to the ground, and carried the people into exile. It was a shattering trauma, one that forced the survivors to reckon with their identity. Why had this happened? The prophet's answer was clear, because Israel had forsaken Yahweh for other gods. In exile, the theological vision sharpened. No longer was Yahweh merely the God of Israel. He was the only God, the creator of all nations, the sole ruler of heaven and earth. The older language of divine councils and subordinate gods was reframed. Those other gods were no longer deities at all, but angels, messengers, or poetic metaphors. The commandment to have no other gods became not just a matter of loyalty, but a statement of cosmic truth. The exile also created something else, a fierce guardianship over the sacred texts. The scrolls that preserved the older traditions were recopied, edited, and interpreted through this new lens. Where the past spoke of Yahweh among the gods, the present insisted that he alone existed. Where the past hinted at a queen in heaven, the present erased her name. And yet, the traces remained. Like faint brushstrokes beneath a restored painting, the earlier vision of a complex divine world lingers under the surface. Psalm 82 still begins with Yahweh standing in the midst of other gods. The book of Job still opens with the sons of God presenting themselves before him. The divine council remains, not as a rival pantheon, but as a reminder that Israel's journey to monotheism was one of transformation, refinement, and redefinition. It was a journey that began in the high places and household shrines of a land filled with many gods, and ended in the conviction that there was only one. But in between, in the centuries of tension and transformation, the spiritual world was crowded, contested, and alive with voices that have long since faded, or perhaps been made to fade. Among the most unsettling discoveries, for those who imagine ancient Israel as purely monotheistic from the beginning, are the inscriptions, written by ordinary hands, not priests or prophets, that reveal a more complex reality. In 1975, at a remote desert site called Kuntillet Ajrud in the northeastern Sinai, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient fortress or way station. Scattered among its debris were large storage jars, their surfaces marked with inscriptions and crude drawings. On more than one jar, a phrase appears that has since become one of the most controversial in biblical archaeology. Blessed be X by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. The casual tone is striking. No elaborate defense, no attempt at justification. To the writer, invoking Yahweh and his Asherah side by side was apparently as natural as invoking a royal couple. Scholars debate whether Asherah here refers to a goddess, as she was known in Canaanite religion, or to a wooden cultic object representing her. Either way, the implication is unavoidable. In at least some corners of ancient Israel, Yahweh was not imagined alone. This was not an isolated find. At Khirbet el-Kham in Judah, a tomb inscription from the 8th century BCE carries a similar blessing, again pairing Yahweh with Asherah. These were not the words of foreigners. They were written in early Hebrew script by members of the very culture that later would proclaim Yahweh as the one and only. Why did these pairings exist? The answer may lie in the earliest stages of Israelite religion, when Yahweh was worshipped alongside other divine beings, perhaps as the chief god in a council that included a consort, just as El, the high god of the Canaanites, was paired with Asherah in their pantheon. Over time, the attributes and roles of these deities merged, and Yahweh absorbed their titles, their powers, and eventually their worshippers. The language of the Hebrew Bible itself bears the marks of this transformation. The word Elohim, usually translated simply as God, is grammatically plural. It can refer to the God of Israel, but in other contexts, it refers to gods in general. "You shall have no other Elohim before me," says the first commandment. "Who is like you among the Elohim, O Lord?" asks the Song of the Sea in Exodus. The plurality is embedded in the very word. Even the divine title El Shaddai, often rendered God Almighty, has debated origins. Some see it as a name inherited from Canaanite religion, where El was the supreme deity, and Shaddai may have referred to fertility or mountain power. Such titles were not discarded in Israel's transition to monotheism. They were reinterpreted, recast to refer exclusively to Yahweh. But if the official theology moved toward exclusivity, fragments of older imagery survived like fossils embedded in the rock. In prophetic visions, Yahweh still rides on the clouds, a role once attributed to Baal, the storm god. In poetic passages, he is still called Father of the Gods and Most High, titles that once belonged to El. The cherubim who guard his throne recall the winged guardians of Canaanite temples. Even in post-exilic literature, when the commitment to monotheism was firm, echoes of a layered divine world remain. In Daniel's visions, the Ancient of Days sits enthroned, but other heavenly figures, Michael, Gabriel, act as commanders of celestial armies. In later Jewish apocalyptic writings, the heavenly court is vast, filled with thrones, dominions, and powers. The older pantheon has been reframed, but it is still there in shape, if not in name. It is as though the memory of many divine beings could not be entirely erased, only renamed, redefined, and absorbed into a hierarchy under one supreme God. What had once been fellow deities became angels. What had once been a queen of heaven became a forbidden's memory. What had once been the high god of the Canaanites became the sole God of Israel. And through it all the inscriptions, the idols, the plural words, and the poetic fragments remained, small but stubborn reminders that the story of Israel's faith was not written in a single stroke, but in layers, each one built upon the ruins of the last. To understand why Israel's theology narrowed from the complex divine landscape of its early years to the exclusive monotheism we know today, we must look not only at religion, but at politics. In the ancient Near East, religion and politics were inseparable. A king's power was legitimized by the god or gods he served, and temples were as much centers of government and economic control as they were places of worship. In such a world, controlling religion meant controlling the people. This is why the reforms of King Hezekiah in the late 8th century BCE were so significant. The biblical record tells us that Hezekiah removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. These high places were local shrines scattered throughout the land, each with its own altar, and often its own unique practices, some to Yahweh, others to different gods, and many that blended the two. By destroying them and centralizing worship in Jerusalem, Hezekiah was not merely enforcing theological purity. He was consolidating national loyalty under the God whose temple was in his capital. A century later, Josiah would go even further. His reform was sweeping, ruthless. Idols were smashed, priests of foreign gods executed, altars defiled. The Ark of the Covenant was restored to a place of honor, and the newly rediscovered Book of the Law, likely an early form of Deuteronomy, became the standard by which the nation would be judged. The stated purpose of these reforms was to eliminate idolatry and bring the people back to exclusive worship of Yahweh. But the political benefits were clear. No more competing centers of worship, no more local priests with their own followings, no more altars that might draw loyalty away from the Davidic throne. one God, one temple, one king. These reforms did not emerge in isolation. They were born in a time of geopolitical tension. The great empires, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, loomed over the region, demanding tribute, threatening invasion. In such a climate, religious unity became a tool for survival. If the people were to stand against foreign powers, they could not afford to be divided in their devotion. And yet, even with royal decrees and the destruction of rival shrines, the old practices did not vanish overnight. Household idols still appeared in homes. Offerings to other gods continued in secret. The prophets railed against a people who could swear allegiance to Yahweh in public, yet pour out drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven in private. Then came the catastrophe. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell to Babylon. The temple was burned, the monarchy ended, the people carried into exile. This was the crucible in which the final form of Israel's monotheism was forged. The prophets interpreted the disaster not as proof of Yahweh's weakness, but as punishment for unfaithfulness. The exile was the ultimate consequence of centuries of divided worship. The gods of the nations had been temptations, and those temptations had led to ruin. In Babylon, the Israelites lived among a people whose gods were many and whose temples were grand. Yet in that foreign land, surrounded by polytheism on a scale they had never seen, they made a radical choice to double down on their devotion to one God. They began to define themselves not by land or temple, but by covenant and law. It was in exile that many of the Hebrew scriptures were compiled, edited, and preserved, and in the process, the theological lens was sharpened. The older stories, with their hints of multiple divine beings, were reframed to fit the new clarity. Yahweh alone was God. All others were nothing. When the exiles returned under Persian rule, they rebuilt the temple, but the religious landscape had changed forever. The high places were gone. The Asherah poles were gone. The very idea of worshiping other gods had become not just a political betrayal, but a spiritual impossibility. Israel had emerged from exile not as one people among many with their own God, but as the people of the one and only God. And yet, if you dig deep enough, the traces of the old world still shimmer beneath the surface in the inscriptions that pair Yahweh with a consort in the plural forms of ancient titles in the poetic visions of a crowded heaven. The official history may tell of a seamless monotheism, but the archaeological and textual record tells of a faith shaped in conflict, molded by necessity, and refined by centuries of struggle between the many and the one. From the windswept hills of Canaan to the towering courts of Jerusalem, from the household shrines buried in clay to the sacred scrolls guarded in exile, the story of Israel's faith is not a straight, unbroken line. It is a winding road through centuries of belief, reform, and transformation. We've walked among the ancient inscriptions at Kuntillet Ajrud and Khirbet el-Qam, where Yahweh's name stood beside Asherah's unashamed, unquestioned, part of the language of devotion. We've handled the clay figurines of goddesses hidden in the corners of Israelite homes and stepped into the shadowed ruins of temples with 2 standing stones in the holiest place. We've listened to the voices of the prophets, crying out against the worship of Baal, the Queen of Heaven, and the hosts of heaven itself, not as abstract warnings, but as urgent pleas to a people who were already blending old gods with the God of their fathers. We've stood in the heavenly court of Psalm 82, where Yahweh presides among other divine beings, and followed the shifting meaning of Elohim, a word that once could embrace the many, but would come to define the one. We've watched Hezekiah and Josiah tear down the high places, burn the Asherah poles, and demand all worship be brought to Jerusalem, not only to purify the faith, but to unite the kingdom under one God, one temple, one throne. We've seen the fires of Babylon, where the temple fell, and the people were carried away, and we've watched how exile became the forge of a new identity. In a land of countless gods, the Israelites bound themselves to one with unbreakable conviction. They returned changed, guardians of a faith sharpened into exclusivity. Their God no longer one among many, but the only God in heaven and on earth. And yet, in the layered texts of Scripture, in the poetry of the Psalms, in the whispers of archaeology, we can still hear the echoes of a more complex divine world. A world where Yahweh reigned supreme, but the heavens were not empty. Where loyalty was demanded, but the presence of other powers was acknowledged. The journey from the many to the one was not a moment. It was an evolution. It was political and spiritual, cultural and theological, shaped by war and peace, by loss and restoration, by the constant tension between tradition and reform. In the end, the Israel that emerged gave to the world one of its most enduring ideas, that there is one God above all. But the path to that belief winds through the valleys of forgotten gods, past the ruins of forbidden altars, and under the watchful eyes of a divine council now hidden from view. The question remains, were those gods ever real? Or were they shadows cast by the One?